And just waiting for confirmation from YouTube, and it says that we're live. So, Mr. Padilla, I think that must mean that we are live, and it is now 7 o'clock on Monday evening. Good evening, and welcome to all of you who are out there in YouTube land. Welcome to not only to students, but to parents, guardians, caregivers, all of you. I sent
Confirmation
Mr.
from
Padilla.
YouTube.
I forgot to mention to you, Mr. Padilla, that I did send the link out in Parent Square as well. So I wanted to make sure to remind the all of our grown-ups of our students that we were going live and we're doing the review.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to give Steven a shout out because Steven specifically asked for a shout out in the YouTube chat. You too can, we would be happy to give you a shout out in the YouTube chat as well. Ryan giving you a shout out, so welcome. And Mr. Padilla, are you excited about this exam that's coming up?
Yeah, I think we're all gonna do well, and I think it's mostly we're just covering all the stuff we've already learned. There's nothing new. Yeah, I think we should be ready, especially after tonight.
Very good. Very good. Well, we definitely, Mr. Padilla and I discussed this in advance. We definitely want to make this time worth your while. We usually go for about an hour, sometimes a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less. But we definitely want to make this worth your while. So the items, the information that we're discussing this evening, there is a very, very strong likelihood that this is going to appear on the exam, right? We want to make sure that this is time well spent, that you're not feeling like this is time wasted. So we're going to go over the content and basically the content from the study guide, right? And while I'm noticing some chat popping up, first of all, Aaron, hello to you, Aaron. Riley, we're going to give a shout out to Riley, and then to my lovely wife, Mrs. Ippolito. She also gave us a shout out as well. So hello, Mrs. Ippolito. Okay, so Mr. Padilla, I think the way we're going to do this, and I will go ahead and I'm going to do a screen share here, is we're going to go through the Civil War Unit Exam Review Study Guide, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, because essentially going on with along with that same theme of we don't want to waste your time. We want to give you resources that are going to be helpful. We gave you a study guide on paper. And by the way, if you're like, I can't find my study guide, there's a digital copy. We pushed out the digital copy previously in Google Classroom. Also, just pushed it out like, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes ago again. So it should be right at the top of your stream in Google Classroom if you're looking for a digital copy. And then, by the way, I should mention that in the digital copy, there are hyperlinks for each question. There are hyperlinks to the handouts, to the assignments, the activities that we are going to be talking about, so that if you're like, I can't find this paper anywhere in my binder or in my backpack, there are digital copies here as well. So, Mr. Padilla, we're going to go ahead and focus on, oh, and then probably another thing worth mentioning too, Mr. Padilla, before we get any further, is we are focusing specifically on study guide questions 1, 2, and 3. And because we just didn't get enough time to get to number 4, we are scratching through number 4, right? So
Yep.
number 4, which was a focus on the Gettysburg Address, it breaks my heart. You still need to know the significance of the Gettysburg Address, but not all of the details, because we simply just didn't have time to go over it. But we've got plenty of other great stuff to talk about. So, Mr. Padilla, why don't you go ahead and take us through question number 1?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just read it just to read it aloud. What were the biggest differences between the North and South as the United States approached the Civil War? So we're talking about basically separating, the two sides of the war, so it makes sense to talk about how they were similar and how they were the same. We're gonna start with let's start with the causes of the Civil War resource itself. Can I have that open, Mr. Polito? That one's good, yeah. So I think either one of those resources, yeah, but we'll start with this one by the numbers. Either one of these resources can give you a perfect explanation. Specifically, this one is it's a beautiful, I mean, the chart right there gives you a beautiful explanation of exactly how the North look in comparison to the South, how the Union look in comparison to the Confederacy. So if we just scroll down a little bit, the chart right there just gives us the exact numbers of how the North look in comparison to the South. So biggest thing to think about, especially when leading into a war, is population size. So North averaged around about 20 million, 22 million individuals in the North versus 5 million freed people in the South, meaning 4 million enslaved, 9 million total. Big note here, is that the 4 million enslaved were not fighting in the war, right? We didn't really have any enslaved Americans grabbing guns or, participating in the battles. But the biggest difference here is for sure, at least the most critical difference when comparing the North and the South, is the population size. That is one of, if not the biggest difference between the two. When you're fighting a war, you want more people, and all the positives that come from having more people in a war. So when we talk about, oh, what other positives are there besides just having manpower? Well, if you just look at the other items on the chart, numbers of finished goods produced in America, meaning all the things that are being produced into like guns or finished products, meaning things that are like usable. 90% of that is fulfilled, is created in the North, in the North. So once again, that's another advantage that you should know for the exam. The North was able to create things that the South simply could not. The South, if you remember correctly, the South was more of a like a farming society, which is the biggest difference, or one of the bigger differences. South was a farming society focused on growing cotton and shipping that cotton to the North for that to be produced into things like clothes. North was a more city urban type environment where they were using factories and mills to produce these finished goods. So when you're in a war, uh, cotton, although it's useful, right? It's cotton, raw cotton, although useful, is not exactly usable on its own. So you want finished goods, you want finished items, and that's something the North also had. Textiles, we can pretty much the same thing as clothing, textiles, clothing, cotton, meaning clothing. A lot of the clothing was produced in the North, which makes sense, right? Because it was a factory industry versus the South, which is more just cotton farming. Shoes and boots, similar to clothes, everything was produced in the North, 30 times more than that of the South. The North had more iron, which means more resources, more firearms, which means they were more ready for the war, more railroads, which is railroads, transportation of goods, transportation of soldiers. They had twice as many railroads. And finally, just more soldiers in general, 2 million versus 900,000 men. When we think about the North versus the South, in terms of advantages, the North had good population, finished goods, resources, and just like a readiness for the war, right? They had a railroad, for example, a readiness to be able to fight in this war. But as we know, and as Mr. Ippolito will get to more into number two, the war did not start out very good for the Union. They were losing battles left and right, which we'll talk about in a second. So then you would ask the question, how is the South able to win these battles or win a lot of these early battles when they are losing or when they have all these disadvantages to keep up with, right? They have such a small population. They don't have any finished goods. They don't have as many guns. How are they doing it? Biggest difference, biggest advantage that the South has is military leaders. We talked about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. These leaders, specifically Robert E. Lee, they were much better. They were much more strategically advanced in comparison to many of the Union military leaders early on, such as we joked around a lot about McClellan, for example. McClellan was just constantly the Union general, was just constantly losing battles to Lee, right? To the South, although it had all these disadvantages, it was a farming society instead of like an industry or like a technological industry. They had military leaders that were able to ultimately run circles around the Union Army for a long time. So although like just to give you like an example, although they had like a smaller population with men, the South had a smaller population, which meant they had less soldiers. Lee would make it so that he would form his army so that it looked like that he had more numbers than he actually did. So he would make sure to shift them around to kind of confuse, for example, McClellan, and McClellan would think, oh, the South has much more men than we think. I'm not going to charge. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to disengage. So when you think about advantages for the South, think military leaders. When you think about advantages for the North, think population, think finished goods, think about factories that are able to produce all these good things that you need for a war. Now, uh, those are some differences for the North and the South. Now, if we answer the second question, what were the key events that led up to the start of the war? Let's go to that causes of the Civil War document, Mr. Plato, that one right there. Yeah, I think this one, although we had if you guys remember, we had a whole activity based off of reading this document and looking for bias in it. And although we did identify some bias, I think that the causes that are listed in this document are totally fair to think about and consider as things that may have played a role in starting the Civil War. Now, the first one, and the one that I feel like this document didn't maybe highlight too much on, was the biggest one, right? Slavery. It's highlighted there in yellow. And although it says slavery is generally given as the main reason for the Civil War, me and Mr. Plato, I'm not speaking for Mr. Plato, we want you to know that it is the main reason that the Civil War happened. So when you want to think about the main reason for the Civil War, you think slavery. Now, of course, it is not the only reason why the Civil War happened. And this document goes through many other ideas that the North and the South were going through that ultimately led to the polarization, the split between the two regions, right? States' rights versus federal rights. That is something that we talked about very early on, but the South was heavily into states' rights, which meant that they wanted the power to, they wanted their state the power to decide things like slavery, like should our state have slavery? That should be a state decision. While states in the North preferred a strong federal government, meaning that they think that the federal government should be able to decide if slavery should be abolished or not. So immediately we see this split between the North wanting a strong federal government and the South wanting stronger states' rights. If we keep scrolling down, some other good ideas, other good causes. The nullification crisis, although that is something that was an idea that the southern states should be able to kind of, I would describe it. I'm going to use the word directly in the document. They think that just because the federal government has maybe the power to pass a law, the southern states wanted the right to just say, no, I'm gonna deny that that's a law. I don't think that is something that we have to follow. We're gonna do our own thing. This goes back to the idea of the southern states wanting stronger states' rights, and they like this idea of nullification because that means that the states have more power. That they have the power to say, no, the federal government is not gonna. I don't like that law. That law is like unjust or something along those lines. I'm not gonna follow that law. So keep scrolling down. This one goes back into the second point that this document kind of talks about is it compares their industries. And if I've talked about it a little bit before in the previous document, but the South was a farming society, which meant, or they were growing things like cotton. Cotton was king at the time. So with that, the South relied heavily on slave labor, right? And the South relied on slave labor to earn their money. They're not going to be very willing to give up their money, right? Their property. At least that's how they've seen it. Now the North was and I said this before, but it was a factory society, a little bit more advanced in terms of producing, finished goods and textiles, stuff like that. They didn't rely on slaves, right? Now, we did talk about, I believe we talked about in one of our classes that, of course, factory conditions were not good and they were treated maybe something similar to slaves, but ultimately, those people that were working in those factory jobs are paid and they were not slaves. They had civil rights. So the South relied on slaves, the North did not. So the North sees the practice of slavery as kind of immoral and wants to abolish slavery. The South sees it as their moneymaker. They need to be able to make money. They need to be able to produce cotton, and the North needed the cotton. So that's another dispute when thinking about the North versus the South is comparing their economies and what they wanted, right? South wanted the slaves to be able to produce cotton, to be able to produce money. The North wanted, they wanted money, but they didn't like the idea of using slaves, right? They preferred, obviously, they preferred the idea of outlawing slavery. This idea of abolitionism was much more prevalent in the North. Figures like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, all these figures were pushing for the abolition of slavery, especially in the North, because that's where it was more popular. The idea of it was more popular.
And Mr. Padilla, if I can jump in for just a quick moment, because you touched on something really important, which was the poor working conditions of these northern factories. And you're absolutely right that there were some people, especially in the South, who said, "Hey, wait a minute, look, Northerners, you can't criticize us as much as you are because here you have these factory workers who are working, 12, 14, 16-hour days. You've got dangerous working conditions. You have no breaks. You have, of course, there's no air conditioning at this time, very little in the way of central heating. If people's hands got stuck in a machine and got mangled, there's no such thing as that at this time as workers' compensation. There's nothing like that. So these factory conditions, these sometimes the Southerners could say, well, you know what, your working conditions are not very good. Of course, the biggest difference, of course, between enslavement in the South and factory work in the North is that you could choose to work in a factory or not. And whereas enslavement, there is no choice. It is, enslavement is wage theft, it is human trafficking, it is kidnapping, it is all of those things, and you are, locked in. Basically, it's intergenerational, right? So definitely, yes. Sometimes the working conditions were pretty miserable, but certainly nothing compared to this, race-based system of chattel slavery where you are enslaved because your mother was enslaved, because your grandmother was enslaved, this like intergenerational system. So I just wanted to jump in there real quick. You're doing a great job, by the way, Mr. Padilla. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure, there was factories are bad, but there was not slavery, right? So we keep scrolling down. I believe there we go. I'm looking for these other ideas that led to the causing of the Civil War. That picture there, we've had a couple presentations about it. We have John Brown raiding. Well, let's start with the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually, and then we'll shift more to John Brown. Kansas-Nebraska Act for sure, another big event leading up to the Civil War, leading up to the beginning of the Civil War specifically. It was that Kansas and Nebraska they were deciding which if they should be a slave state or not, and the government was basically they said, you know what, we'll give you this idea of popular sovereignty, right? So we're going to let your state choose. You're going to vote on it, and you're going to determine if your state has slavery or not. Now, sounds like a good idea. And, some people do argue that popular sovereignty is a great idea, but it led to a lot of conflict in these states, a lot of battles, or I shouldn't say battles, but a lot of skirmishes, right? And this is a lot of historians will argue that maybe this is the start of the Civil War because there was these skirmishes. People from outside of Kansas and Nebraska were flooding into these states to submit their votes because they were an abolitionist and wanted slavery to not exist, or they were a Southern, they liked the idea of slavery. They were part of the South, part of the South. They made money off these enslaved people, so they wanted to go to these states and put their vote in for whatever side that they represented, which led to a lot of, they call it bleeding Kansas, led to a lot of skirmishes between these two groups fighting one another. So although they were trying to simply vote, there was so much tension that there was a little bit of blood, spread, a little bit of battles, or a little bit of smaller scale battles, and eventually this figure of John Brown pops up. And John Brown was a part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or sorry, he was a part of the Bleeding Kansas, which is the name of the skirmishes in Kansas and Nebraska. But then John Brown kind of takes it a step further, right? And if we scroll down just a bit more, I believe it talks about, where is it? I think just a little bit more. We'll go back to the Dred Scott decision in just a second, but I believe it talks about John Brown in that middle paragraph right there. Just a
Oh,
bit
sorry. Which way do you want me
below
to go?
below Dred Scott.
Below Dred Scott. Oh,
There.
yes. Okay, this is the Harper's Ferry raid.
Yes.
Yes,
And
got it.
then John Brown participates in this bleeding Kansas, and then he wants to push it even further. And a lot of people, a lot of historians, and even me and Mr. Plato would argue that uh, this event, this thing that John Brown does, leading to the invasion and the pretty much the battle at like Harper's Ferry. John Brown, he gathers a whole bunch of people and he decides, hey, I'm going to go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. I'm going to lead a raid. I'm going to give other Black Americans these guns that are here. I'm going to arm them all, and eventually with these new guns, they're going to lead their own uprising, and all the enslaved people in America will lead a revolution and have these guns and pretty much end slavery on their own, but with the help of John Brown. He was thinking this big plan of, getting these guns and starting like a revolution and ending it there. But ultimately he gets caught, he gets executed, and Southerners see this and they see crazy, crazy John Brown. They think of him as a typical Northerner, or as a typical like he represents the North, and he came in here and he started violence and he wanted to take our slaves. So now we're going to start ramping up. We're going to start getting ready to go into war. We're going to start producing guns. We're going to start gathering armies. So the raid at Harper's Ferry is definitely one of the key events that causes the Civil War, because it gets the South to start thinking, hey, now it's time. They started the violence. Now it's time to start getting our armies ready. And then finally, or maybe I should, well, we'll start with this one. Um, the election of 1860, probably the cause of the Civil War happening. Uh, as we know, as you guys talked about for the Electoral College lesson, Abraham Lincoln gets elected, and the South decides to, or at least states in the South, start to secede because they believe that with the election of Lincoln, even though he said that he would not take their enslaved, people, that he would ultimately abolish slavery. So we have Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and so on, North Carolina, South Carolina, deciding to secede because Abraham Lincoln gets elected, right? And that is for sure something that, I mean, that's the immediate split that causes the immediate split of the two nations, right? The Confederacy is born when pretty much Lincoln gets elected, because that's when they decide to secede. And then I didn't talk about it, but if you scroll up just a little bit, the Dred Scott decision, definitely something that caused a lot of tension in American politics at the time. There was this idea or Dred Scott, he decides to kind of sue. I believe he sues the Supreme Court. Who does he sue? Anyways, he brings it up to court that he thinks that because he traveled to free states, that he should be granted freedom, right? Because he's in these free states for a year or two at a time, and he thinks that because of slavery is abolished in these states, that he should get freedom, right? So he sues, and then eventually the Supreme Court decides, no, no, you are still property in no matter what state you go to. You started off as property, and therefore, just because you go to or live in like a free state for a little bit, it doesn't mean you're free. So this caused a lot of tension, especially with abolitionists who see this as an insult to civil rights, which it ultimately was, right? So another idea leading to this like split between abolitionism and the idea of Southern states just really, really wanting to keep their slaves, keep the enslaved. Um, I think that's most of, well, I think you'll go over the Battle of Fort Sumter a little bit in question two, but I'm going to hand it off. If you guys have any questions, I'll be in chats to answer anything related to question one.
All right, Mr. Padilla, thank you so much. Okay, so I did want to, before I jump into question two, there were a couple of questions in the chat, Ryan and Vanya. So Ryan asked, do you know how many questions or points? Is it all multiple choice? And then Vanya asks, what will the short response questions be about? So Mr. Padilla, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've said this to all of our classes, to all of our students, that it will be similar to the format of other exams we've given, right? It's, in other words, mostly multiple choice and then a few short answer at the end. Um, I think to try to give like how many multiple choice questions is it going to be? I'm not going to commit to that right now. I will give my same answer that I always give when I don't know, which is more than one and less than 1,000.
Mhm.
Uh, we do have the entire class period. There's nothing else that we're doing on the day of our unit exam. So, be prepared to use that entire time. Not that I want to make it, and I think I mentioned this at least to our period 5 class. I don't want to make this a huge, overwhelming, undertaking. But I do, it is going to cover, there's a lot. The Civil War is big. The Civil War is the biggest war in American history. And so, expect for there to be a lot of important questions about important things. Um, and then, so there will be, to answer both Ryan and Vanya's questions, uh, the mostly multiple choice and then a couple of short response. Mr. Padilla, maybe at the end, we might tease a little bit about what those short response questions are. Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe.
maybe.
But really, Vanya, to answer your question, the short answer questions could be about anything. And so, that's going to kind of be that basically what I do when I write an exam, and of course, Mr. Padilla and I are writing this exam together, is I look at the multiple choice and I kind of think, what has not been touched upon yet? What has not yet been covered? And so that generally tends to be what we cover in the short answer. Or I'll be like, you know what is it that I kind of want for us to go into greater depth or detail on that you really you can't assess in a multiple choice question. So, um, okay. And then Mr. Padilla, it looks like did we ever get the retake for the quiz we took a few classes ago? Oh, yes. And just to make this clear, because I don't know if I think we answered this question individually for some students, but I thought we put it on the agenda, Mr. Padilla. Um, about the retake. So the retake, just to be clear for everybody who's watching this, I feel like we've talked about it in class, but the retake, if you were unhappy with the score that you got on the love and war quiz, then the retake opportunity for that quiz is going to be the score that you get on this unit exam. That is the retake opportunity. So you get a higher score. This kind of is motivation for you to do well on this unit exam. You get a higher score on the unit exam, and then that percentage you just have to ask for it because it's not going to happen automatically. Could I please have that percentage applied to the love and war quiz? Does
Yeah,
that, Mr. Padilla, does that seem clear now?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty, so now jumping back into question number 2, describe critical developments and events in the war, including major battles, geographical advantages and obstacles, technological advances, and generally surrender at Appomattox. So I'm going to kind of go over this, go over the vocab, go over some of these handouts here. Mr. Padilla was kind enough to already go over crash course by the numbers. So I don't need to once again talk about Union versus Confederacy advantages. I will, however, talk about the Anaconda Plan because I do think that is important. So I'll go ahead and bring this very famous political cartoon in. This is Scott's Great Snake, which of course is a reference to Winfield Scott. He was the original general, like lead general of all of the Union armies and kind of really representative of the problem, the challenge that Abraham Lincoln had, because Winfield Scott by this time was in his, I want to say his mid 70s. He was a hero of the Mexican American War. Just for context, the Mexican American War, if you recall, 1846 to 1848, we're now in the 1860s, and he is still like the lead general of the Union Army. So he's an older dude. He's so big, he can barely fit on a horse. This just looking at Winfield Scott, I will do this because I want to, uh, just to kind of give some context here. Here is our buddy Winfield Scott. Uh, and there he is at the time of the Civil War, kind of looking cranky, and definitely looking like, oh, I got to do another war again. I don't think he was very happy about it. So this kind of represents, I think this face represents the challenge that Abraham Lincoln had at the start of the war. he had generals who were either just like old from a from a bygone era, or they just were not as skilled, not as tactically skilled, militarily skilled as the Confederate officers, the Confederate generals. So let's go back now to the Anaconda Plan. And there were three parts to the Anaconda Plan. And if you want to go over this, Mr. Padilla, I feel like we also put this at the bottom of. Yep, there it is. And there, hey, we'll give a shout out to Rafi from our period 5 class because he wrote these notes and he drew this snake. There's the Anaconda Plan. So there were three parts of the Anaconda Plan. The first was surrounding, and what this means is surrounding the ports. So what the Union wanted to do, this is the Union strategy, right? And if we're taking this much time to talk about a strategy, a war strategy or battle strategy, then it's probably, if we're taking the time to talk about it in a review, it's probably very likely that this could appear on an exam. Uh, Part one was to surround the southern ports or capture the southern ports. So you wanted to capture the southern port of New Orleans. You wanted to capture the southern port of Charleston, South Carolina. You wanted to capture the Chesapeake Bay here with Virginia, the port cities of Virginia and North Carolina. Port city of Atlanta is not on the coast. Savannah, I think, is on the coast. If I know my Georgia geography, I think maybe. Anyway, Mr. Padilla, why is it so important to capture those ports?
Yeah, as I talked about, the South was growing cotton, right? And they were wanted to be able to kind of get that cotton sold, right? That's how they make money. And who are they selling it to? Well, they're selling it to, other European countries, right? Or even just if they wanted to sell it up north, even. The best way to transport that is through these ports. And that's how
Yep.
they make their money. And if they surround those ports, or if the union surrounds those ports, then they're not making money.
So there's no way they're cutting off their ability to make money from the cotton exports. They're also cutting off the South's ability to, if they were going to try to buy arms from European countries, buy guns or cannons or cannonballs or gunpowder from France or Britain, that is severely impeded as well if the Union Navy cuts off these southern ports. So part one, let's go to, there it is right there. Surround the southern ports. Rafi started the notes and didn't finish that part. But Rafi, we're still appreciative of you. Thank you. Part two is take control of the Mississippi River. When you take control of the Mississippi River, and on the map, there's the Mississippi River right there. Basically, you cut the Confederacy into two pieces: the Western Confederacy over here, and then the Eastern Confederacy over here on the eastern side of the Mississippi. You also further basically damage or destroy their ability to conduct any kind of trade, to move troops up or down the Mississippi River. You effectively split the enemy country in two by capturing the Mississippi River. So one, surround the ports; two, capture the Mississippi River; and then three is capture the capital. So I'll scroll back up here, where somewhere I put these notes somewhere, Mr. Padilla. And I can't remember where, but I do remember it was on some iPad notes somewhere. Uh, anyway, that's going to bother me. But basically, it's the Latin root. The Latin root for head is capitas, right? So if someone loses their head, you're going to learn about this in 10th grade U.S. history, the French Revolution, right, where people get decapitated with a guillotine. So decapitate means to remove your head. The capital city is the capital. It's the main city of a country. So the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. The capital of the Confederacy was Richmond, Virginia. So the third and final part of that Anaconda Plan right here is capture the capital city of Richmond, Virginia, because just like in many wars, once you march in, the war, World War II in Europe was pretty much over when the Allies, including the United States, marched into Berlin. That's the capital of Germany. The Civil War was pretty much over when the Union marches into the Confederate capital, which is Richmond, Virginia. Okay. So we talked about already, Mr. Padilla talked about Union versus Confederate advantage, talked about the Anaconda Plan. Let's talk really quickly about, and I when I say quickly, I mean really quickly, these battles here and the significance of these battles. And by the way, if you're like, Mr. Ippolito, you're going too fast. Well, one of the things that you can do is you can watch the oversimplified, because nope, this one right here. Oversimplified Civil War battles. This was the video that you watched for the Ed puzzle. Some of you maybe haven't watched it yet. There were still, Mr. Padilla, we probably have a good 20 to 30 students out of all of our classes that
Wow.
have not yet done this Ed puzzle. This Ed puzzle is going to be very helpful to you in breaking down all of these battles because that's what this is all about. But the first oversimplified that we did was on, and I will open this up now. It's probably already opened elsewhere, but I'll open this one up. What's the significance of, oh, and there's Anaconda Plan again.
Mhm.
Significance of the attack on Fort Sumter is the first conflict, right? So this was the very beginning when I'll go here to the map. The Fort Sumter was located in Charleston Harbor in Charleston, South Carolina. Abraham Lincoln was trying to just provision the fort, basically get them more supplies. He's like, I'm not sending them any weapons. I'm just sending them supplies, just like food and toilet paper and, the essentials that they need to survive. This was right after South Carolina had seceded. South Carolina seceded in December of 1860, and then Fort Sumter basically runs out of supplies by April of 1861. And so that was the standoff. That was like the spark that began the Civil War because Lincoln's like, I'm just sending supplies. This is not an active war. I am sending a ship down with just now. Were there guns on that ship? Maybe, maybe. But this was strategic. The Fort Sumter provisioning was strategic on Lincoln's part because Lincoln did not want to be the aggressor. And he says this in his inaugural address. He says, we will not be the aggressor. You yourselves, he's talking to the South, you yourselves will be the author and finisher. If this war, if we're going to go to war, and it was a month before Fort Sumter when he gave that speech, if we're going to go to war, it's going to be your fault, Confederacy. So Lincoln is trying to set up a situation where he's not going to be the aggressor. He's not going to be the one to start the fight. But once the Confederacy sees this ship coming down to Charleston Harbor, they're like, oh, no way. You can't do that, Lincoln, because we own the harbor. Well, Lincoln's like, nope, we are the United States Army. We still own this United States fort that is located on this island in Charleston Harbor. And so that's when the Confederacy attacks the Union at Fort Sumter. The Confederacy, they're the aggressors. They're the ones who take the first shot. And it is a bloodless beginning to the bloodiest war in American history. No, I think there was just one horse that was killed in the Battle of Fort Sumter, which was not even a battle, it was an attack. Okay. Moving on to the Battle of Bull Run. That's just the opening battle of the Civil War. I would say the significance of the Battle of Bull Run. Do I have it? I have too many tabs open, Mr. Padilla. Where do I want to be? Here. Battle of Bull Run. Basically, these are notes, by the way, that we did. Oh, there's my capital notes right there. It just lets us know that it's going to be a long war. The Battle of Bull Run, if you recall, this is from the oversimplified video where they're talking about how there were picnickers. There were picnickers like on the side, on the hillside, just like, oh, this will be fun. Like they're watching a concert or a football game or something. And it turns out that there are bullets whizzing by their heads as they're like with their picnic blanket and everything. And they're like, "Whoa, we got to get out of here." So the lesson learned from the Battle of Bull Run was this is going to be a long war. This is for real. These are real bullets. There was real bloodshed. There were real, like, people died in this battle. Americans killing other Americans. This is going to be a long and bloody war. The next battle, the Battle of Antietam, I would say the biggest takeaway from the Battle of Antietam, this is in September of 1862. Up until that point, the war was not going well for the Union. The Union was bungling. If you recall from Mr. Padilla talking about General George McClellan, the Union was bungling through loss after loss. Lincoln was going through multiple generals. I think this was before the first time he's going to end up firing McClellan twice. Anyway, George McClellan got a break because if you recall from, I think this was in the video, we talked about it. One of the Union, reconnaissance missions, somebody who was a spy or just someone kind of, scoping out the terrain, finds Robert E. Lee, who was the lead general for the Confederacy, finds Robert E. Lee's battle plans wrapped around a bundle of cigars. And so that was a huge, huge break for General George McClellan. The Union ends up winning the Battle of Antietam, which, by the way, was located in Maryland. This was the first of two times that General Robert E. Lee is going to try to invade the North. Let's go back here to the map because I like this map. There is Maryland. Robert E. Lee is going to try to invade Maryland at the Battle of Antietam because he wants to hook around and eventually capture Washington, D.C. Again, that's a strategy for both sides, right? Capture the capital city, and you can end this war if you capture the capital. He was repelled. He was pushed back, pushed away by General George McClellan. And so what this opened up for Abraham Lincoln, this war was going badly. But the Battle of Antietam opens up the ability for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So he issues the draft of it, the draft copy. He releases it September 1862. This is what it's going to look like. And then it takes effect January 1863. And since we're already talking about it, Mr. Padilla, does Emancipation Proclamation appear? Is that in? I think we're saying that it's included in number 2. It is so important. I'm just going to include it in all future printed versions
Yeah.
of this study guide. But I'm telling you right now, the Battle of Antietam opens up, we've talked about this plenty of times, opens up the ability for Abraham Lincoln to reveal the Emancipation Proclamation from a position of strength rather than it looking like a desperate move. The Emancipation Proclamation does a couple of very important things. Number one, it says that as a battle strategy, as a war strategy, that the Union is going to be freeing all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion. So what that means is if you are enslaved and you are in Texas, you're free. Louisiana, you're free, except for New Orleans, because New Orleans at that point had already been taken under Union control. So the enslaved people in New Orleans, not yet free. Mississippi, free. Alabama, free. Georgia, free. Florida, free. Border states, those enslaved Americans in the border states, not free because Lincoln has to keep the border states. He has to keep control of the border states. He has to keep them happy. And so it says only those enslaved Americans in areas currently in rebellion are set free. And so he's selling it the to the North as a battle strategy. He's not yet ready. He's going to be ready by the time of the Gettysburg Address, but he's not yet ready to say that this war is actually about giving freedom to all Americans. The other important part of the Emancipation Proclamation is it's going to authorize the use of black troops finally in the Union Army. This is what Frederick Douglass has been pushing for. Mr. President, you've got to let us fight. Let's do this. We can help you win this. We've got hundreds of thousands of black troops ready to go, ready to fight for the Union Army, to fight because Frederick Douglass knows he's ready to make this a fight for freedom. So those are the two things that the Emancipation Proclamation does. Battle of Gettysburg. Real quick, this is the turning point of the war. This is the second time. I'm going to go back to this map. Second and last time that Robert E. Lee tries to push the war into the North. This time he's going into southern Pennsylvania here, right? So Robert E. Lee pushes way, way into the North. Again, his plan is to once again try to hook around, kind of do a little end around and flank the Union troops and march into Washington, D.C. He is repelled. Oh, I can see the George Gordon Meade, I think is the Union general. I don't even think you need to know that name, but you should know that Robert E. Lee's second attempt to invade the North and a huge battle in the North once again fails for the Confederacy. It is the final time that Robert E. Lee is going. It's a huge defeat for Robert E. Lee and a huge defeat for the Confederacy. He is going to have to push back, retreat back into Virginia because it's just such a miserable loss for him. Never again are. Never again will Lee or any other major Confederate army try to invade the North again. That is July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And then simultaneously on the 4th of July, this is approximately where Vicksburg is right here on the Mississippi River on the border between Arkansas and Mississippi. It is on the Mississippi side. General Ulysses S. Grant captures this. This was what is the term, Mr. Padilla, for when an enemy, when the army surrounds the enemy and just kind of waits them out. What is that tactic known as, Mr. Padilla?
A siege.
Siege, yes. So this was the siege of Vicksburg. So all that General Grant has to do is just surround the city. And this is kind of the final stronghold of the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. So Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. The siege of Vicksburg finally ends, and General Ulysses S. Grant captures the town of Vicksburg, basically unlocking the entire Mississippi River and bringing that part of the Anaconda Plan online. The Union now has entire control over the Mississippi River. That took place on July 4th, 1863. So think of these back-to-back victories for the Union. Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Battle of Vicksburg, Siege of Vicksburg, excuse me, July 4th, 1863. That right there, beginning of July, is going to be the turning point of the Civil War. And pretty much at that point, the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. It is the Confederacy after that will not win any further major battles. It's the beginning of the end for the South. Moving on. Mr. Padilla, thank you for throwing that in the chat, by the way. Sherman's March. Let's go back to the map because I love this map so much. General William Tecumseh Sherman. He believes that if we take the war, this is now moving into the next year, 1864. General William Tecumseh Sherman believes if you take the war to the people, it is an idea called total war. If you take the war to the people, then even though it is brutal, it will end this war more quickly so that we can all go home, so we can all have peace more quickly. And so this idea of total war is salting the earth. It's burning down buildings. It is ripping up railroad tracks. It is cutting down trees. It is basically directly impacting the civilian population. So it's not just like going to battle against other soldiers. It's not just like engaging another army. It is like tearing the landscape apart and burning down cities, burning down buildings, ripping up infrastructure, basically saying, you know what? We're gonna make life miserable for the civilians, right? Civilians are people who are not directly engaged in battle. They're non-soldiers. They're civilians. They're just the regular people living there. And some people are like, whoa, this is way too harsh. This is, oh my goodness. But this Sherman's march through Georgia is, first of all, it's going to be one of the things that helps Abraham Lincoln win re-election in 1864 because it just, boom, it pounds into the South this very clear idea that they are going to lose this war. It's either Sherman marching into Atlanta or marching into Savannah. I think it was marching into Savannah, where Sherman finally says, you know what? This is by December of 1864. Merry Christmas, Mr. President. Georgia is my Christmas gift to you, where basically he had just pounded Georgia into submission. Total war, William Tecumseh Sherman. That is the significance of Sherman's march. And then finally, Appomattox, that is April of 1865, 4 years after the war began. The war began in Virginia in 1861 with the Battle of Bull Run. It's going to end in Northern Virginia in 1865 with a complete and total and unconditional surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. That is where General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. Mr. Padilla, is there anything else that we need to mention in number 2?
I know we had a question about like a Black American's role, and I know we do. I'm just trying to think about where it fits. I'm in the study guide. I'm guessing it's more towards number 3 then. About that.
I think, you know what? I'm going to say that what we learned about the role of Black Americans during the Civil War, I think that's going to be we where do I want to if we're going to say where did we learn about this, Mr. Ippolito? We learned about the role of the Emancipation Proclamation. We learned about the role of abolitionist leaders like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass during the Civil War. We I think beyond that, I think it was mentioned in the Civil War battles Ed puzzle. I also think it was mentioned in the Oh, it was in Crash Course Black American History. That's where it was. I'm like, I know that we learned this. Yes. Yes, that is an important resource as well. That's something that is not on the study guide, but as I mentioned, uh, the study guide may not contain everything that's going to be on the exam, but it's pretty darn good. Yes, please make sure. Thank you for mentioning that. I know I know that we learned about this. It's in Crash Course Black American History, Black Americans in the Civil War. Okay. Uh, Mr. Padilla, thank you. Are we ready to move on now to number three?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Padilla, what do you think? Because again, we've talked about this a little bit, Mr. Padilla and I. Um, what are we thinking about what we're going to include specifically? We got 10 minutes left in our review time
Yeah.
that we're going to include from the Love and War Civil War love letters. What do you think?
I think for this one, it's similar to the Love and War quiz in that we are questioning you on more so the general ideas of the letters, rather than the quiz featured some questions that were specific to each document, and I don't think we're going for that on the unit exam. More so the ideas that the letters are kind of discussing. So if we open up Love and War, Civil War letters, for example, and we talk about even just like the first two letters that we talked about in class, which was the Lucy Webb Hayes interaction with Rutherford B. Hayes. We're talking about ideas of love, obviously, like how who was being or how people loved one another in the Civil War, which was not through letters, right? They expressed their love through letters, and the idea of communication kind of taking long and the letters taking like 9 or so days to get to one another. So we're talking about those ideas rather than like specific details about each document. When you're talking about document one and document two, you can talk or you should remember ideas of like women's role in the war, for example, such as taking up politics and taking up ideas or taking up tasks that were normally masculine, right? Taking on these duties, um, and also just the idea of how individuals communicated with one another. Um, so instead of focusing on too much of like specific details, just focus on, I would describe it as themes, right, Mr. Ippolito?
I think that is good. Yes. Also, I am going to say, uh, I am. So here's what I'm doing. Since we're talking about this, and since we're talking about love and war, I think it is now appropriate, because I had it because we still had some students who had not yet taken the quiz. I believe we now have everyone who has taken the quiz, and so I now feel comfortable. I am going through all of Love and War, and perhaps someone who is perhaps a student who is on this live right now can log on to Formative, and I think there we go. If you could go into formative, if you wouldn't mind, because I can't see it from the student's perspective, I can only see it from my teacher perspective. Can you now see the questions and the answers? Can you now see what you got right and what you got wrong? I think that's really the question that I would like to find out, because I want if students want to be able to go back, I completely shut it down previously in formative, but now I want you to be able to go in and be able to see this so that you can see what you got right and what you got wrong in advance of this exam. I think that's reasonable. So if someone can throw that in the chat, I would love that. Um, in the meantime, Mr. Padilla, while someone is hopefully looking that up, just talking really quickly about Ashley, thank you. Lyric, thank you. Uh, they said yes. Very good. So it's possible, Mr. Padilla, we're going to throw maybe a couple of questions, exact same questions or similar questions from the Love and Work quiz. We'll throw them right here on the Civil War unit exam. Really quickly, just to talk about vocabulary. So morale, we talked about morale in terms of, this word morale means this is the feeling, particularly in a time of war. We talk about morale. Is morale high? Is morale low? It's just like how you're feeling about everything, right? What is your, we can either talk about your personal morale or we can talk about the morale of a nation as a whole. I'll give you an example, use it in a sentence. Union morale was high on July 4th, on Independence Day, 1863, after the back-to-back victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, right? Union morale was high. In other words, they were like, we're feeling good, we're feeling victorious. This is going well. We're pleased. This is really good. I'm feeling good. So, in the context of these letters, we see morale, we see like the highs and lows of morale within these letters. For example, Mr. Padilla, I think it was one of the later letters, right? It was like 8, 9, or 10, where we see this really low morale. Uh, yeah, I think it's more here in 8 and 9, where you just see this sense of, and it's August of 1863, right? So this is after this is after the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. This is starting to be the beginning of the end of the Confederacy, and you can see that Confederate morale is starting to go down, right? Letters reveal a growing disillusionment with the Confederacy. To be disillusioned means like, I don't know if I believe in this cause anymore. I don't think I'm not sure we're gonna win, or if it's like maybe we should just end this and just go home. So morale is like how you're feeling, particularly in war, how you're feeling about your cause, how you're feeling about your chances, how you're feeling about just kind of like life in general. You have high morale or low morale. Patriarchy, we talked about patriarchy in the context of this is still the United States is still very much a patriarchal society, patriarchal structure. And as we talked about before, in times of war, men go off to war. And so women have to step in and take on roles that were traditionally male dominated roles. They had to not only take on the roles of being a wife and mother, caring for the home, but also taking care of finances. And you see that in Lucy Webb Hayes's letters to her husband Rutherford. Like she's like, "You'll be so proud of me. I was taking care of all the financial stuff." And uh, it is in times of war, and you're going to see this again, World War One, World War Two, especially when women are entering the workforce. The patriarchy is challenged. This idea of male-dominated society, male-dominated economy, time and again is challenged in times of war because women step up and step into roles that are traditionally male-dominated. Camaraderie. Camaraderie is just like that feeling of brotherhood or kinship, like togetherness. So, I would say that there was a collective in letter number 10, for example. If we go down here, this is the one where the Confederate and Union soldiers, it's near the end of the war, July 1864, where they're like down by the river and they're trading like tobacco for knives or whatever they're doing. So there was almost like this collective sense of camaraderie among all soldiers, North and South, towards the end of the war, because they're like, you know what, we're just at the end of the day, we're tired and we're all humans. And but camaraderie is your ability to like stick together, right? Stick together. We're all in this together. Very High School Musical. Disillusionment, that kind of goes along with that low morale, letters 8 and 9, where people were starting to get towards the end of the war, especially the Confederates were feeling disillusioned about like, I don't even know, is this war even worth fighting for? I think we should just, we just need to end it. Terms of endearment. Terms of endearment are sweetheart, honey, my love, my dear, my darling. Those are examples of terms of endearment. You see a lot of those in these letters. Telegraph, this was in the context of, we were talking about how fast news travels. And the mail was actually traveling fairly quickly, if you recall, in our discussion of the Hayes, Lucy Webb Hayes and her husband Rutherford Hayes. Letters were able to travel in about 9 days from home, and their home was in Ohio, to the front, which was in Virginia. And but she was getting news more quickly from the newspaper because the newspaper had the advantage of the telegraph. And in the telegraph, you could send news. It's like instantaneous over the wire, right? This is the original text message, where information is traveling over wires over long distances where this is how newspapers were getting reports of war. This is how the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was getting reports from the battlefield instantaneously. He was in the telegraph room in Washington, D.C. a lot because he wanted to know. He was very emotionally invested in the outcome of the war. He wanted to know what was going on. And then finally, honorable manhood. This is, oh, that heartbreaking, heartbreaking letter. This is the letter from Sullivan Ballou to his wife. But oh, Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they love, I shall always be near you. This is the part with the honorable manhood part is right here. When God willing, we still have lived and loved together and seen our sons grown up to honorable manhood. So, what does this idea mean of honorable manhood? It's the idea of being a person who honors their word, who stands up for their country, who is just a good and moral and decent person. So, I think I wanted to throw that in there just because I love that letter so much. Okay, Mr. Padilla,
Yes.
uh, what do we need to? Is there something that's not refreshing?
Apparently, some of the students don't have access to the formative that was just opened up. I'm not sure.
What do we do if the quiz is closed? Oh, maybe let me go into the settings and after submission, uh, I'll try this. Okay, so I'm changing to after submitted to when closed. I still, I only use formative a few times a year, so I still haven't mastered all of the settings. But I'm going back in and maybe someone can tell us if it's now. Oh, Aaron just said it's open for me.
Yep.
Ava, try it. Try it again. Ava, and see if that works. Aaron says it's open now. So Ava, it should be open for you as well. Okay, and really this is we want to make sure that it works for all four of our class periods. So
Yeah.
if you happen to be Aaron says it's open, so we know for period 4, Aaron's in period 4, right? We know it's open for period 4, periods 2, 5, and 6, if you can let us know. Mr. Padilla, any final thoughts? What do we still need to talk about? We've talked about a lot. It's just over an hour, so we're wrapping things up.
Um, just making sure, I mean, obviously filling out the study guide is the best bet for sure, but also just going through most, if not all the resources that we've kind of focused on in the past couple of weeks, just opening them up and kind of refreshing your memory. Although, you think you remember certain details, it's always helpful to look at, especially the notes that me or Mr. Ippolito took on those documents that are available to you. Make sure to open those up, just review them, maybe take some notes on your study guide. Don't leave anything to chance. Just review all the documents, and you'll do great on the exam.
Okay, and then you know what, Mr. Padilla? I'm gonna say it because I want to say, oh, Alessandra, thank you. Alessandra says it's open for period 2. So I think it should now be open for everybody. Mr. Padilla, as a special little shout out for those people who are watching and engaged, thank you for sticking around until the very, very end. I will tell you this, are you paying attention? Are you listening? There is one short answer question. Very likely, there will be a short answer question asking you about your Civil War news story presentation. So our special reward for you for paying attention is just make sure that you know, like you were supposed to research this person or this battle, right? So, and you're supposed to know this person or this battle a little bit better than you know any other part of the Civil War because theoretically you studied this person, you did research on this person or this battle, you should know it. So there might be very likely a question on the short answer asking you, what do you know about your person or your battle from your Civil War news story? So just be prepared for that. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, Mr. Padilla, any final thoughts, things that we're forgetting?
No, period 5. You're having your 5 and 6 having your final exam tomorrow. 2 and 4 will have it on Wednesday.
Yes, that is that's important to note. And of course, that information I believe we put at the top of the study guide as well. But yeah, 5 and
Yeah.
6, we're looking forward to you getting that exam tomorrow. and our last 3 days of the school year. It's we're almost to the end in the final, the home stretch. For those of you, since those of you who are sticking around, remember please to turn in your Ed puzzle if you haven't yet turned in your Ed puzzle. Any other just final reminders we need to give folks, Mr. Padilla?
Turn in your Civil War project if you've not turned that in, 'cause that's still a big grade. Just making sure you have everything turned in so you can earn the most points that you can before your final
Yeah.
grade.
And then the last thing I will say, because I mentioned it in the chat, but I don't think I said it out loud. Ryan asked the question about the study guide. Can we get credit for the study guide? And I'm going to treat this study guide the way I've treated all study guides previously throughout the school year, which is if you would like to turn in the study guide and it is completed and it looks beautiful and like you worked hard on this study guide, then I will give you credit for the study guide, but it will be optional enrichment, meaning if you don't turn it in, you're not going to get punished. Just don't turn it in. It'll just appear as X excuse in Infinite Campus. Okay. Hey, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who joined live, everybody who watched the recording. Big thank you to Mr. Padilla as he concludes. Mr. Padilla, this is your final, these are like your final 3 days of student teaching, right?
It is, yes, yeah.
Well, very exciting. And so thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in our next class and seeing you for this final unit exam on the United States Civil War. Thanks so much for joining us. Take
Yeah.
care. We'll see you next
Luck.
time. And